want to welcome you to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. Special welcome to Thomas Jefferson in North Dallas, all of Dallas ISD, and Sunset of Dallas ISD. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Teachers, if you're watching and you have not signed up, please do so. Go to www.tiny.cc/high school registration and sign up for us, please. The program is Impact of Human Activities. During this virtual field trip, students will evaluate the effect of human activities, including habitat restoration projects, special species preservation effort, nature conservancy groups, hunting, fishing, ecotourism, all-terrain vehicles, and small personal watercraft on the environment. Mr. Dominguez will talk to you about species preservation, the nature conservancy groups, Ms. Ram, Mr. Monroe about hunting and fishing, and Ms. Ramirez about watercrafts. Students, during this program, you cannot ask us a verbal question, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/question-answer and fill out a form and send it to us, and I'll do my best to answer it during the program. If not, I'll send the answer to your teacher and they can talk to you about it. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Mr. Dominguez is going to tell you all about species preservation.
Hey guys, I'm here hanging out with Teddy, one of our redfoot tortoises here at the Environmental Center. And today's topic is species preservation. And although Teddy here is not an endangered species and he's not in danger of going extinct, he originates from a place that is currently losing tons of habitat. One of the main reasons we are losing so much biodiversity. So he originates from South America, and as many of you know, South America is home to the rainforest, and we are losing tons of rainforest every year, which means a lot of animals are losing their homes. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of them go extinct. But there are efforts that try to preserve as many species as possible. Some are very successful and some are not. So we are going to be talking about those efforts today. So let's get started with our presentation, and I'll leave Teddy to hang out near his humidifier. He loves a very humid enclosure. All right, let's leave him alone and let's get started with our presentation. Let's begin by talking about the root causes of biodiversity loss. And it's caused by 5 primary drivers. One, we've already mentioned, and that's habitat loss. There are invasive species, and for those of you that don't know what an invasive species is, an invasive species is just an organism that does not belong in a particular habitat, but that organism is thriving and outcompeting native species for resources. There's overexploitation, that means extreme hunting and fishing. We have pollution. And finally, we have climate change associated with global warming, and that kind of ties with pollution. So these are the main factors that are causing animals to lose their home and are causing them to become endangered. So their numbers are dwindling and therefore are at risk of going extinct. So how much are we losing? It's a lot. According to a UN report, there are about 8 million total estimated number of animal and plant species on Earth. So that includes 5.5 million insect species. Now here are the alarming numbers. So up to 1 million of species are threatened with extinction, many within decades. So that means that this is going to happen within your lifetime, not 100 years or 200 years from now. This is happening now. So over 40% of amphibian species are threatened with extinction. Almost 33% of reef-forming corals, sharks, and shark relatives, and over 33% of marine mammals are threatened with extinction. And here's another alarming statistic. 70%, That's the increase since 1970 in the number of invasive alien species across 21 countries with detailed records. So, a lot of stuff is happening now within your lifetime um, that is hurting our biodiversity. So the big question is, what do we do about preservation? How do we keep these animals from going extinct? Well, trust me, there are some success stories that we can talk about. So, guys, I promise that it's not all sad news. There are some awesome success stories when it comes to species preservation. Now, you guys may recognize this very majestic bird. It is the American bald eagle. And about 40 years ago, this animal was on the verge of extinction due to a few reasons: hunting, habitat loss, and their food source was actually being contaminated by a pesticide, a very common pesticide used at the time, DDT. But people like you acted, and a few laws were passed that helped protect this animal from hunting and also built up the habitat that was being lost. Now, those laws still exist and continue to protect other species. But now, this very majestic and beautiful bird is no longer on the verge of extinction. And it's one of the really awesome success stories that prove that things can be done to help animals that are on the verge of extinction. So now that we know that we can actually do something about species laws, we have to bring attention to some of the times that we have failed to prevent a species from becoming nearly extinct. So, unfortunately, not every country has laws that protect both animals and environments from degradation, and it's unfortunate because we see a lot of examples of the lack of laws directly impacting a species survival. So, for example, the northern white rhino was once common, and as many as 2,250 remained across 5 African countries in the 1960s. But by 2005, there were about 40 animals remaining. And that is an incredible loss. And it is directly tied to the lack of anything being done about poaching. So these animals were being hunted to death. And this is one of the sadder stories that we have to uh, pay attention to and not ignore in order to help other large species from the problems of poaching and hunting. So, even though we have both success stories and failures in regards to species preservation, one of the more important things that we can do is bring attention to the problems that all biodiversity is facing at the moment. So, places like our beautiful environmental center bring attention to those problems. And I'm here walking towards Big Teddy. So, we have Little Teddy and Big Teddy. So, you saw Little Teddy earlier. This is Big Teddy. I'm about to feed him right now. Uh, it is important that we are aware that we are not the only species here on Earth, and that it's going to take a massive effort from all of us to keep species like the redfoot tortoise here, like Teddy, from becoming endangered. So I hope you guys learned a little bit about species preservation today. I hope to see you guys soon in person. Until next time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dominguez. And when you have questions, what is the importance of species conservation and preservation? Conservation protects the environment through the responsible use of natural resources. Preservation protects the environment from harmful human activities. And Congress passed the Endangered Species Preservation Act in 1966, providing a means for listing native animal species as endangered and giving them limited protection. The act also authorizes service to acquire land as habitat for endangered species. And now Ms. Ram is going to tell you about Nature Conservancy groups.
And my presentation goes along with Mr. Dominguez's because all of this stuff can be really overwhelming. And it can be a lot to take on. So that's where Nature Conservancy groups come in. So Nature Conservancy groups are just what you think. They are groups of people who are working to protect the environment and combat climate change. So there's tons of different groups you can join. Even while you're younger, you can join. But we're going to talk mostly about the Nature Conservancy group. There is one that's called the Nature Conservancy. So I think they really kind of outline what most conservancy groups are all about. And they kind of share a main focus. So that's where I got most of my resources today, but we will talk about some other ones as well. So their website where I got my information is at nature.org. So there's tons more information there, and you can also follow them on socials. So the Nature Conservancy, or TNC, has 4 main components of their main focus. So their shared conservation agenda is based off of those 4 principles: protect, climate, food and water, and cities. So let's get into those in just a second. So first, they have 2 paths to 2050. So 2050. If we don't do anything, which is on the left, so we keep going as we are, business as usual, or if we follow a conservation pathway, so follow things laid out by the TNC and other groups. So without conservation efforts, in 2050, temperatures will be up by 3.2 degrees Celsius or 5.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Bad air quality will hurt 5 billion more people than it does today. 84% of fisheries will crash, and only 8% of lands would be protected. So if we follow the conservation pathway, things are a little brighter. Now, they're not perfect, and climate change is still a problem, but it significantly reduces some of those issues. So following the pathway, it's projected that temperatures would rise by 1.6 degrees Celsius or 2.9 degrees Fahrenheit, which, like I said, is still an increase, but it's not increasing as fast of a rate. Bad air quality would affect less than 1 billion more people than it does now, which, like I said, it's still worse, but compared to over 5 billion, that is significantly less. 100% of fisheries would be sustainable. And that is a huge drastic difference between that 84% of fisheries crashing. So that is definitely a strength. And then 17% of lands would be protected. And that's a major increase as well from only 8% of lands being protected. All right, so based on their research, they say that by 2050, we can support both conservation and economic growth. So their 4 tenets were, starting with the first one, protect land and water. So here is a land in Tennessee. It's a mountain range that is protected. So there's no hunting and development. It is a basically big preserve. Then there's also protection for the oceans. So here's a picture of a scuba diver in the coral reef. And if you follow along with what's happening all over the world with coral reefs, there's a lot of coral bleaching. Coral is dying off. It's not reproducing quick enough. Global waters are getting warmer, and the coral cannot live in those temperatures. So to prevent that, a lot of groups and scientists are regrowing coral and replanting them in the ocean. There's tons of efforts to protect coral and kind of bring back those reefs, because the reefs are kind of the base in those ocean habitats, and all the little fish and all the little organisms that live in the reef and depend on the reef are no longer able to find shelter and homes. And that means that the bigger fish are losing their source of food, and so it continues. So protecting land and water is both very important. The other tenet is tackling climate change. So there's smaller chapters of the Nature Conservancy for different countries as well as states. So depending on where you live, you may be more able than others to have certain types of technology. So if you are somewhere where it's sunny and there's a lot of land, you may be able to put solar panels in your state. If you're somewhere that doesn't get a lot of sun, you might not. So depending on where the places are, that's what different states have different strengths and weaknesses, and what they can bring to the table to have a more sustainable power supply. Providing food and water sustainability. So like I said, a big part of what they want to do is promoting fisheries and hatcheries and things like that. So overfishing is a big problem in certain parts of the world, and the amount and the locations, not having enough regulations for the fish populations to bounce back sustainably. So that is a big focus of a lot of groups. And then also with providing food and water sustainability, this is a picture of Brazil and the Amazon, and you can see all that land has already been cleared away for cattle. So how can we use that land again and for farming to produce food as well, as opposed to taking this land that's already destroyed, neglecting it, and then tearing down more rainforest for more farmland. So using what we've already kind of done to prevent using more damage. And then the last focus was building healthy cities. So this is kind of like a prime example. This is like a shining star example. This is the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. And they've kind of designed this high-tech, nature influenced and nature infiltrated area. So it's kind of got overgrown with native plants and all these wonderful architectures that allow people to enjoy nature as well as be a part of the city. So this looks like kind of like an otherworldly thing in a lot of places. A lot of cities would not have the budget for this, but this is a real place in Singapore. And it's just kind of an example of how you can have an extremely urban environment, but still incorporate nature, not only for beauty, but for air quality and all those wonderful things. All right, so different conservancy groups. The one that I got my presentation resources from is the Nature Conservancy. There's a World Wildlife Fund, the Audubon Society, Wildlife Conservation Society, Jane Goodall Institute, American Bird Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, Fin Free, and Shark Angels were just to name a few. And they all have different resources that you can get involved in. You can find them on social media. You can find them all over the place. And there's videos and articles and everything that you want to learn. And there's something for everybody. So if you're into birds, there's conservancy groups about birds. For me, I'm into like the coral reef and marine life. There's tons that focus on sharks and kind of ending stereotypes against sharks as being like stupid and violent, and trying to protect them because they are wonderful creatures. And yes, so there's tons of different resources depending on what you're into. I also wanted to kind of plug some of these documentaries at the end. I know for me and probably a lot of you kids, Sitting down and reading a long science article doesn't sound like a super fun way to spend the weekend, but next time you're sitting there on Netflix or going through Prime Video or whatever you watch, try popping on some of these documentaries because they're really interesting, they're really engaging. And for me, when I'm looking at the animals and I'm seeing the beautiful wildlife and seeing our effects and what's actually happening there, it makes it more meaningful. So these all are highly recommended. Some of them are sometimes hard to watch, but it's really important, especially for young people like yourselves, because the planet that you're given is kind of going to be yours to save. So I highly recommend these, especially the first one, A Life on Our Planet by David Attenborough. Anything by David Attenborough is pretty awesome. So once again, I highly recommend that. That's all I have for you today, and I hope to see you soon in person. All right, thank you, bye.
Thank you, Ms. Schramm. And the question is, what is the mission of the Nature Conservancy Group? Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. To achieve this, we must boldly address the biodiversity and climate crisis over the next decade. By maximizing our ability to affect change between now and 2030, we can shape a brighter future for people and for our planet. Thank you again. And now Mr. Monroe is going to talk to you about hunting and fishing.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking into two forms of recreational sports here in the state of Texas. In fact, they are really important forms of recreation for this state for several reasons. Now, I'm going to start out by talking about hunting. Supposed to be covering hunting and fishing, but hunting seems to bring up the strongest debate about how it impacts our environment. Now, hunting in some areas is part of people's livelihood. They grew up with it, like I did, and it represents something that has been passed on from generation to generation. Hunting is a very big sport in this state. It probably would not surprise you, being that you probably see all these ATVs and you see deer stands being hauled down the highway a certain time of the year. It probably wouldn't surprise you that if we took away all the money that hunters spend, all the money that anglers spend, and all the money that even people that watch wildlife, if we took that away, boy, would it affect this state, the state of Texas, its economy. In fact, the economy would shrink somewhere around $15.8 billion a year. Can you imagine that? What it would do to the economy here? Man, it would really change some things. Now listen, there are pros and cons to hunting and fishing that deal with the impact that it has on our environment. I'm going to focus on hunting today because I kind of know a little bit about hunting because I'm a hunter myself. I grew up in northwestern Oklahoma, and I grew up with hunting being a very big part of my life. Even though I did not have a father around that passed those things down to me, I did have an uncle that was very close to me that taught me how to hunt. And then the people that I grew up with, man, I grew up kind of in a American Indian cultural environment. And I had lots of friends that taught me a little bit about their belief and how they conserve certain things in the environment simply because of their respect for it. Now, listen, there are some negative things. In fact, people frown on hunting simply because they feel like it's cruel, barbaric, and inhumane. The act of hunting has been around since dawn of man and remains a practice today, especially in Oklahoma and Texas, my home state. Many hunters advocate to feel that hunting helps keep animal populations under control. And no doubt, sometimes hunting deer, and that's a perfect example. It is referred to as a deer harvest. You know, consider the white-tailed deer, for example. Years ago, back in the cowboy days, the Western days, there were deer around. But do you know that today there are more deer in North America than there ever has been? You see, the population of deer have generally been held in check by predators, natural predators such as wolves and cougars. But the declining populations of those animals have left the deer with a lack of natural predators. If their population were left unchecked, it would increase dramatically. This would likely cause overbrowsing of wild plants, which could leave deer without enough food to survive. And we see that happening today. Increased impact on agricultural crops, which could hurt farmers and crops, and more collisions with automobiles, which cause property damage and seriously hurt some people. But listen, today we experienced that here at the Environmental Ed Center. Some years ago, we started seeing the deer population increase out here. Probably one reason that the deer population increased is simply because Dallas County does not have what they call a gun hunting deer season. No guns can be used in Dallas County to hunt deer during deer season. And so earlier today, there was a gentleman that came in and reported that a deer had been hit on the road just around outside the main gate of our center. And it was kind of sad. It was a very young deer. And I'm just wondering, probably not much was done to the vehicle that hit the deer simply because of the size of the deer. But I have seen quite a bit of damage to vehicles. And again, we have a large deer population around the center here. And there are communities where deer are searching for food because there's a lack of the natural foods they find in the woods, and they've come into town and they run the risk of being hit by vehicles. So there's a lot of things going on with the white-tailed deer. First of all, one positive thing is it helps control the animal population. It provides food for a lot of the people that consume it. It's also a recreational vehicle. That means that a lot of people use it for family recreation. Now, many avid hunters claim that hunting is fun. It's a fun activity they enjoy. Hunting is considered a pastime hobby for people of all ages in all parts of the world. Families have used hunting as a means of bonding and a source of camaraderie for thousands of years. While it may be difficult to understand, non-hunters, the recreation of aesthetic value of hunting is an intangible and cannot be devalued. Now, also, it's a business problem. You know, taking $15.8 billion out of the economy in this state would really hurt this state. It is a business problem. And I've noticed that a lot of farmers now, especially in the area that I hunt, they have changed the way that they are farming now simply because they are creating what we call game management ranches. What they do, they put up these high barriers, these high deer fences that keep the deer on their property, and then they charge large amounts of money for hunters to come in and hunt on their property. So it's become a big business. Now, that food part, I grew up eating it. I hunt deer now. I look forward to it because I know that when I get my deer meat processed, hopefully I have enough, I'm going to be able to share it with my friends and elderly people in my church and my family because we do consume it as a food source. Now, listen, guys, there are some negative things about it. Just like there's probably positive and negative things about fishing. Now, the negative things is this. People that argue about the deer hunting, basically what they're referring to is trophy hunting. You know, trophy hunting, man, it can get out of hand. In fact, it probably can cause some hunters to hunt organisms or animals that are in danger, just so that they can boast that they have collected or harvested that animal. You know, it's not about the big horns like this, okay? You know, we got some deer out here that have big horns like this fella here that's a 12 point, or this one right here, who's another large deer. And people, if they knew that they could get those deer out here, I think they would be trying to get them simply to get those horns or have it stuffed and mounted so that they have bragging or boasting rights, so that they could brag about their hunting skills. But it's not about hunting skills when you get out there, not with me. It's about enjoying the outdoor life. And hopefully that's the way other hunters like myself feel. Now, trophy hunting is one negative. The other part about hunting, kind of unlike fishing, is that it can be very dangerous. You know, people get in what they call deer stands. And I tell you what, one time I got careless and I'm very fortunate. I actually fell from a deer stand. It was about 10 foot up. And you know what? I didn't hurt myself. I was sore for a few days, but I was very lucky that I didn't end up being paralyzed. I didn't break an arm. I didn't break a leg, but I was sore for quite a while. But listen, dangerous. Even people being careless with firearms that they're using to hunt deer. Those deer rifles that they use can carry quite a ways. And if they're not sure about what they're shooting at, it's best not to shoot. I've learned the hard way. People end up having accidents where they shoot themselves or they mistakenly shoot a hunter that they think is coming through the woods as a deer. So it is a dangerous situation out there. And then a lot of people that argue against hunting say that it is an inhumane suffering of animals. And you know what? I've seen that too. Like today, when that little button buck was hit by a car, it didn't kill it, it crippled it. And we knew that that deer was going to die. So immediately we tried to get in touch with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And it just so happened one of their staff members was in the area and he came out and he took care of the little fella. I'm not going to say how he did it. He did it the most inhumane, most humane way that he could do it. But he took care of the little fella because it was kind of sad to me, even though I hunt deer. Now, we don't want any animals to suffer, that's for sure. And that's why if I'm going to take a shot at a deer, I'm going to make sure that, hopefully most other hunters will do that, that it is going to be a shot that's not going to let that deer suffer. You know, most hunters, most often become conservationists. They promote protection, and they also promote biodiversity. You know, often hunting arguments center around that inhumane suffering of animals. But I will tell you this, if you're not a trophy hunter and you're hunting the right way, it is an enjoyable sport. The same way with fishing. There are regulations that Texas Parks and Wildlife have put into effect, laws that you can be fined, prosecuted, and maybe even spend time in jail if you don't follow those laws and regulations. Just like today, somebody offered to pick that little deer up and take it home and take care of it. That's against the law. There's a regulation. You need to call a Texas Parks and Wildlife game warden and have them dispose of the animal or do whatever needs to be done with the animal. Not take it home upon yourself. That is illegal. Now, I've about run out of time, so I'm going to end with this. One of the things I want you to realize is how important Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is to this state, because listen, their job is to provide outdoor recreation opportunities by managing and protecting wildlife and wildlife habitat. Their mission is to manage and conserve natural and cultural resources of Texas. provide hunting and fishing opportunities for the use and enjoyment of the present generation and the future generation. I'm going to give it back to Dr. Gorman, so if any of you have any questions, I bet he can answer those for you. You guys have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. And how does hunting help conserve wildlife? In the first half of the 20th century, leaders like Theodore Roosevelt and Aldo Leopold shaped a set of ideas that came to be known as the North American model of wildlife conservation. They articulated the philosophy that all wildlife belongs to all of us, that every citizen is entitled to the opportunity to hunt and fish, and that ethical, regulated hunting is the driving force that maintains abundant wildlife. Simply put, the United States has the most successful wildlife management system in the world. And now Ms. Ramirez is going to tell us about watercrafts.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about the benefits and the negative aspects of using watercraft. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and we'll get started. So let me pick up the screen share. There are a couple of essential questions that I would like for you guys to focus on while we're going through the presentation. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer these two questions. The first is explain 2 negative impacts of boating or watercrafts on the environment. And the second is, are there any positive impacts of boating? And see if you guys can explain that. So let's go ahead and jump right into our presentation. On the first slide, we're going to go ahead and talk about the negative impacts of boating and watercrafts first. So in this first little video clip, you see a guy that is creating some massive waves using that watercraft. Those waves are called wakes, and wakes sometimes are not a good thing. So I know if you want to have fun and have that adrenaline rush, you want to have those great big wakes, but it's not really good for the environment. So a wake is simply the waves created by watercraft. So sometimes you might see, if you ever go to a state park or a lake and you see the little sign that says slow, no wake zones, those are just areas where watercrafts have to go very slow to reduce the waves that they create. And waves can be a bad thing because waves can actually erode the streamlines, the shores, the banks. And again, erosion is just that washing away of sediment. So whenever those big waves, if they're very frequent and they're constantly pounding against a stream or a shoreline, the soil is eventually going to erode or wash away. Also, those wakes and the vibrations, some people might feel that they are harmful to the environment. They're impeding on their habitat and where they live. Something else about boating and watercrafts in general, if you look at this little clip here, we have a person who has launched their boat in an illegal spot. So typically, if you're at a state park, you really need to launch your watercraft from the designated boat dock area. They really don't want you to go into areas that are not designated for that, because you can actually kill a lot of the native vegetation and grasses that are in the area. You also will create erosion as well. So you can see that this watercraft, it slid into the dirt, and you can see where the vegetation and dirt can potentially be washed away. So if you do own a watercraft, it is highly recommended that you launch your watercraft from the designated locations. Another negative impact of boating, if you can look at these two pictures here, you might experience oil and gasoline leaks. So we know that oil and gasoline can pollute our waterways. So it's very important that if you do have boats, that you take good care of them and you regularly are doing maintenance on them. That way we don't experience that leakage of oil and gasoline. And then also, with boating, we might experience an increase in litter and pollution. So oftentimes, if you've ever gone to a state park before, you might see people enjoying, their nice boat and then just toss their trash out on the side. That trash has a huge impact on the aquatic life that is there. So pollution can be seen as an increase when we start experiencing all the boating activity. And then another negative impact that I didn't quite think of before until I was doing this research was the sewage from boats. So if you've ever seen those big boats, especially the big pontoon boats, they might have a little porta potty, kind of like a little specialized toilet for the boat. Sometimes if those people are not disposing of that boat toilet properly, if they're putting that sewage, just dumping it back into the water, it actually has a lot of fertilized stuff in there. So it can actually increase algae growth in that water source. And we know that if we increase the algae, it's going to eventually decrease the oxygen that's available for those aquatic organisms. So if you do own a boat that happens to have its own little special potty, make sure that it is an approved toilet. It's been approved by the U.S. Coast Guard, and it's been discharged into a approved pumping station. And a lot of state parks have a pumping station specifically for that boating sewage. And I'm sure, as Mr. Monroe knows, people that go fishing, they can spend hours on a boat. So a lot of boats do have their own little special toilet. So let's talk about another negative impact, and this is probably one of the biggest ones, and this is invasive species. So a lot of invasive species are transmitted because of boating. So here on the left, we have zebra mussels. They are an invasive species originally from Europe and Asia. In 1988, they were actually introduced into the US, and in 2009, Texas saw its first zebra mussel. And these guys are super invasive. They're really bad to have in a water source because they will attach to just about anything, the boats, the pipes, the docks, and they will affect the water supply in shores. And one of the reasons these are such a bad invasive is because one adult can actually produce about 1 million larvae a year. And one of the reasons that these guys can spread so easily is because the larva is microscopic. So it's essentially invisible to the naked eye. So many times people will go out into the water with their kayak or their canoe or their boat, and they won't even know that they have a hitchhiker on their boat because they're so small you can't see them. And so that's why it's important that if you do use a watercraft, that you thoroughly clean it before you go into a new water source. That way we don't transmit anything new. So that's the zebra mussel. The other one is the giant Salvinia, and it is a Brazil, it's also known as the Brazil floating fern, and it's of course from South America. It looks like a big clump of leaves, but the thing that's bad about them is they will double in size in about 4 to 10 days. And because they have such a rapid growth rate, they will create these dense mats of vegetation that blocks out the sunlight. And when we block out the sunlight to those aquatic plants and animals, it's also depleting oxygen. So these invasives have a huge impact on other organisms and the environment. And we have both of these invasives here in Texas Lake. So that's why it's important to always be a responsible boater and make sure you're not transmitting anything new into a new environment. Now let's quickly talk about those benefits. One of the huge benefits of boating is the revenue that we get from it. So Texas Parks and Wildlife, about 30% of their revenue comes from different boating aspects. So fishing and hunting licenses, a portion of those funds go into Texas Parks and Wildlife, as well as boating manufacturers, dealers, the boating title fees and boating sales. All of those taxes are being contributed to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department gets a lot of money from those recreational boating uses. And Texas Parks and Wildlife, in turn, will use those funds to help promote things like boater education, habitat restoration of aquatic environments, and youth programs. And then one of the important reasons for me is it's important to get you guys outside to just encourage a love and respect for nature. So I believe that if people didn't enjoy being out in the water, if they didn't have that opportunity, they probably wouldn't care about protecting it. So that's, to me, is one of the biggest benefits of getting out into the water in nature, is to learn to love it and respect it, and then you'll want to protect it. And then there's also a book called The Blue Mind by Wallace Nichols, and he goes over the science behind the health benefits of being out in the water and on a boat. So you can see in this little infographic here some of those benefits. Those that are on a boat, they have those feel-good hormones, the dopamine and serotonin go up. About 72% of Americans say they feel healthier after spending time on a water. It's just a peaceful recreational activity. And then my challenge for you guys is to find and visit a state park or local park near you and think about what evidence of human impacts do you see. You can also visit the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department website to find some state parks near you. The state parks are relatively cheap, ranging anywhere between $5 to $10 for a day use. And then on this video, you just see an example of our lake. It's the Post Oak Preserve Hidden Lake. And when I went walking out there, I was trying to look for evidence of human impact, and I saw a lot of negative evidence with trash and litter. So people like to go to the Hidden Lake because it's a great fishing spot. It's too small for motorized boats, but we do get a lot of people in canoes and kayaks that go out there as well. So again, think about what evidence of human impact do you see around parks near you. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and we're going to give it back to Dr.
Thank you, Mr. Maris. Now I'm going to share my screen. During this virtual field trip, students evaluated the effect of human activities, including habitat restoration projects, species preservation efforts, nature conservancy groups, hunting, fishing, ecotourism, all-terrain vehicles, and small personal watercraft. Mr. Dominguez told you about species preservation, Ms. Schramm about nature conservancy groups, Mr. Monroe talked to you about hunting and fishing, and Ms. Ramirez did watercrafts. Thank you for joining us. If you would, teachers, go to www.tiny.cc/hsfeedback, fill out a very short form and send it back to us. We would appreciate it. You guys have a great rest of the day. More importantly, have a great rest of your life.